Hi guys, welcome to a video, and in today's video I just wanted to talk about the 1960 film Blood and Roses as part of my vampire lesbian film review series, which was not really a thing, but it's kind of turning into a thing now. My throne of lies has become a throne of truth. So, if you're not familiar with this film, Blood and Roses is about a young woman named Carmilla who is possessed by her vampire ancestor, and soon after, her insatiable thirst for human blood begins to terrorise the inhabitants of the estate. Oh yes, it's yet another lesbian vampire film based on the 1872 novella Carmilla. There's too much hand action in this video, I apologise. Keep 'em coming, that's what I say, keep 'em coming. Now, as a disclaimer, this film is not overtly lesbian because of the time in which it was made. There was a lot of censorship. But for my core audience, also known as dykes, and yes, I know not everybody's a dyke, I know, what a shame. If you do choose to watch this film, be prepared to sit through a lot of heterosexual safety nets which shroud the main sapphic romance. I know not everybody will interpret this film as a sapphic romance or a sapphic love story, but it very much is, and I'm going to explain why in this video. First of all, what I like the most about this film is how much it honoured the novel it was adapted from. Unlike some other lesbian film adaptations of Carmilla, which I won't name names, but it's The Vampire Lovers. And although this film very much ties into the whole tragic lesbian death, predatory lesbian stereotype, cliches, it is, I believe, at its core, a sapphic love story which embodies the romance that was in the Carmilla novel. It just does so in a way in which the audience have to kind of put the pieces together themselves. Yeah. Kind of like Xena Warrior Princess before season 6, you know. So, let's get into why I think this film at its core is a sapphic love story. Starting with the title of the film, Blood and Roses, which I think fairly obviously alludes to the horror and the romance elements in this film which become intertwined. The word blood is obviously connected to the vampirism in this film, and the word rose is obviously connected to the romance. And the rose is especially significant because it's used as a visual clue that the interactions between Carmilla and Georgia are romantic. In fact, it's essentially the biggest clue in this film that their relationship is a romantic one. Near the beginning of the film, we have Carmilla talking about the red rose in the portrait of her ancestor. And this is an important scene because it's relevant to the ending of the film. Carmilla says that flowers always fade in a vampire's hand, which we will keep in mind for later on. Now, the film also sets up a love triangle between Leopoldo, Carmilla, and Georgia. Carmilla is seen looking longingly at Georgia and Leopoldo and displaying jealousy. Because of this, she's accused several times throughout the film being in love with Leopoldo, but she never actually confirms this, which I think was a deliberate choice on the writer's part. And when Leopoldo kisses her, it becomes awkward, and Carmilla says that she cannot love anymore nor give pardon, essentially rejecting him. Now, if we compare that kiss to when Carmilla kisses Georgia, or even when Carmilla visits Georgia in bed, there's a stark difference in the tone and in the way these scenes are acted out. Carmilla and Georgia's scenes are filled with romance, tenderness, and suggestion, whereas any quote-unquote romantic scenes with Leopoldo and Carmilla are devoid of any of that. So I think it can be argued that throughout the film, Carmilla is actually in love with Georgia, and that's why she stares at the couple longingly and displays jealousy. Of course, she doesn't admit this, and it's very much left up for interpretation because of the time in which the film was made. But really, the sapphic elements in this film only survived in the first place purely because of the ambiguity surrounding Carmilla's intentions and her feelings. It is, of course, worth mentioning how the vampiric aspects of this film intertwine with the romantic ones. Because yes, there is an argument similar to that in the Carmilla novel that the sapphic elements are present purely because of the vampiric ones, which of course ties into homophobic notions about how homosexuality is unnatural unnatural, unholy, and almost spreads amongst people as though it were a disease. And we all know the kind of connotations between vampirism and sexuality, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think that the film portrays lesbianism in a negative light at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I found the lesbianism in this film, no matter how suggestive, to be very kind of tender and romantic, which is similar to how I felt about the romance in the novel. And actually, even though Carmilla is possessed when she advances upon Georgia, she does display jealousy towards the relationship between Leopoldo and Georgia before the possession takes place. So that's interesting that perhaps the tendencies were there even before she was possessed. Of course, then we have Georgia handing Carmilla a red rose just before the kiss, which obviously has romantic connotations. This scene is less about what's being said and more about the visual clues. As Carmilla clutches the rose, she kisses Georgia and then lets go of the rose against her. Georgia doesn't pull away from the kiss, but they are interrupted, and after the interruption follows a close-up of the fallen rose on the ground, which I feel is symbolic of a doomed romance, which encapsulates their relationship perfectly. If we then move on to Carmilla visiting Georgia in her bed at nighttime, we can see that this scene is also very tender and romantic. It's both subtle and powerful, but what's interesting is that when Carmilla approaches Georgia, Georgia says Malaka's name in her sleep, not Carmilla's. This suggests that Georgia recognises Malaka has possessed Carmilla, and it's possibly Malaka that she is entranced by rather than Carmilla. It's worth noting that Malaka doesn't murder Georgia in this scene either, like she does to her other victims, which adds another layer to their relationship within the confines of vampirism. Interestingly, Georgia asks Carmilla near the beginning of the film if Malaka would want to kill her because of Malaka's history with killing the brides. And Carmilla says no. And again, this is open to interpretation, but I think Carmilla says no because she wants to spare the one that she's in love with, and she projects that onto Malaka, which then of course becomes true. Lastly, at the very end of the film, we then have Georgia clutching a red rose to her chest on the way back from her honeymoon, which is of course significant for two reasons. The first is the rose signifies a romantic attachment to Carmilla or Malaka. It's intertwined with their kiss. It indicates that she's holding that memory close to her. And secondly, it also suggests that she's now a vampire herself, because the rose starts to fade in her hands, which brings us back to the quote I was talking about earlier, where Carmilla says that flowers fade in the hands of a vampire. So, whilst the film is not explicit about the sapphic romance for obvious reasons, it's still very much there for people who want to tune into it. And the film ends in much the same way that the book does, in that it's heavily insinuated that Carmilla's romantic feelings were reciprocated, and the film suggests this by its use of the rose. In my opinion, of course. It's not a happy ending by any means, but I don't think that makes the romance any less meaningful or really take away from the fact that it was a sapphic romance to begin with. It's also interesting to note that Carmilla doesn't return any of the male advances in this film. And for a film made in the 60s, for a main female character to exist outside of a heteronormative romance really goes against the grain. But once again, that just says to me that the writers and the director understood the assignment. They understood what the book was about, and they honoured that as much as they were able to in this film. Sapphic romance aside, I actually thought this film was incredibly interesting from an artistic standpoint. There's a lot of interesting visual choices, particularly the dream sequence, which I found to be eerie and thought-provoking. I did wonder that if in the dream sequence all those other women were Malaka's victims, or perhaps there was another meaning, but I just found it really interesting, so Overall, I think this film is a very thoughtful and layered production. It's visually beautiful, and despite the heterosexuality, it's definitely one of the better adaptations of the Carmilla novel that I've seen. Okay guys, if you've seen Blood and Roses, let me know your thoughts on it down in the comments section below. If you're a lesbian, if you're a lady of the night, come and join the Sapphic Underground Club. Just come and join it. We are inclusive to the undead. We are. Don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment, and I'll see you guys soon.